Are we on? I believe. Are we working? Can you folks see and hear me? I certainly hope so, because I'm about ready to get going here, and I hope you are as well. I am delighted to be here with you, though only virtually. This will be my first opportunity to address folks in Poland. And while I have not had the pleasure of being in Warsaw or elsewhere in person, I'm glad to be part of your conference, the Report on Education, today to, I hope, share some ideas that may be relevant not only to those of you who are educators, but also to those of you who are parents who may want to be listening with two ears. And I appreciate your making me part of your conference today. I have been asked to speak to you about a topic that has been on my mind for many years that implies that we need to question the way we do things with respect to not only how we raise and teach children, but also how we as adults interact, what our workplaces and playing fields look like. And that is the concept of competition. Competition refers to an arrangement in which it is possible for one person or group to succeed only if others fail, because the situation has been set up that way in the first place. So I want to begin by describing two academic studies that I find interesting. They were done by the same researcher who's now at Harvard University here in the United States. I often like to begin a lecture on any number of topics by describing a study whose results might have surprised even the researchers themselves, and certainly many other people who hear about it. The idea then is that you can actively make meaning around, construct sense with respect to the results of the study, instead of just passively listening to the results. Those of you who are good teachers know that the best teachers do not spend their time talking at students. The students do most of the talking in effective classrooms. They spend most of their time in pairs and small groups learning with and from one another. And the teacher wanders around listening carefully and helping to frame the discussion when absolutely necessary. Lectures are the old school that assumes that students are empty receptacles into which knowledge is poured. But the best cognitive science we have suggests that learning comes from an active process of talking and arguing and making sense, creating, being critical thinkers. Anyway, here are the two studies I have in mind for today's topic. The first one was done at birthday parties for little kids, ages 7 to 11. They were asked to make collages. Perhaps you remember what collages are, where many different kinds of artistic materials were combined on a sheet of paper in different ways to create a kind of interesting and open-ended design, something that many kids like to do. These children were divided into two groups at the birthday parties. Half of them were just told, here's some materials, have fun, be silly, enjoy yourself. And the second group, given the identical materials, was also told, there's going to be a prize for the best collage. Then all the children were left to set up their collages however they wanted, and their results were then collected and shuffled and later distributed to a panel of professional artists to evaluate who didn't even know what the study was about. And it turned out that the children who were trying to do the best collage and win a prize actually did the worst collages. They were less creative, less complex, less varied, less artistic, according to the professional judges. That's sort of interesting and a challenge to what many of us assume might have been the case. A couple of years later, the same professor did some research with business people. Her topic of study, her field, is creativity for all ages, both genders, all sorts of types of creativity. And she had the business people show their creativity in a different way. She didn't give them collages, but had them try to solve puzzles or problems that required creative, out-of-the-box thinking. They were divided into two groups randomly as well. Half were just asked to see if they could solve these problems, and the other half were told that there would be a prize for the most successful puzzle solver. And once again, the results turned out the same way. That is to say, the business people who were least successful at solving these problems were those who were trying to beat everyone else and be the best at solving puzzles. So here we have two different ages and two very different measures of creativity converging on the same result. That when you have people try to compete and be better than everyone else, and then perhaps win a prize, that turns out not just to be ineffective, it turns out to be counterproductive. Something about it undermines the very creativity that people were trying to promote. Now, if I was there with you in person now in a workshop, I would stop and ask you to turn to a partner, find somebody else near you, and take a couple of minutes to discuss these results and see if you could formulate a hypothesis together. Why do you think that competition actually makes children and adults less creative, less effective than having no competition at all? And if I asked you this during this workshop, I would also emphasize that I'm not looking for a correct answer. The best teachers, again, are not focused on getting kids to produce the right answer. Even in math, where there is a right answer, the most effective teachers are not showing students step by step how you solve a problem, but requiring that the students invent ways of solving the problem. And if they get it right, the teacher might respond with, "How did you get that?" And if they get it wrong, the teacher might respond with, "How did you get that?" Because the thinking is more important than just the right answer. And so here I would be looking for anything you came up with that helped you to make sense of this surprising counterintuitive result. We're not in the same room though, so I merely ask you individually to take a moment and think about why the results here might have turned out the way they did. I'll come back to this question of effectiveness and creativity and so on. Let me take a step back now and think about competition in a more general sense. There are three ways to achieve almost any goal we might have, any task. Whether we're talking about building a house, writing a paper, cooking a meal, anything. We can do this thing with other people, cooperatively. We can do it apart from other people, independently. Or we can do it against other people, competitively. In the purest case of cooperation, things are set up not just so we exchange ideas, but so that it's impossible for me to succeed unless you succeed too. Our fates are linked. We sink or swim together. And each of us has a built-in incentive to want to help each other to do as well as possible. In the second arrangement, I do my thing, you do your thing, and my results don't have any impact on you, and yours don't have any impact on me. We're two separate islands. The third possibility, competition, also has our fates linked, like the first arrangement, but negatively linked. So we can describe mutually exclusive goal attainment, which is to make it sound fancy and scholarly, which basically means I can succeed only if you fail, as opposed to I can succeed only if you succeed, or I can succeed regardless of what the heck you do. I was raised in the United States to believe that there are two acceptable positions regarding competition, the third of these arrangements. The first possible attitude to have about competition is that it is a good thing, it motivates people to do their best, we should have people competing at work, at home, at school, at play. We should start as early as possible to train students for a competitive world out there with all kinds of contests and prizes, that competition brings out the best in us, that it builds character, and that without competition, people would have no incentive to try hard, no motivation, and would be lazy and do nothing. The second acceptable position is a more moderate version of that, that says competition can be done to excess. We can do it too early to children, we can do it too much, get carried away, so it's destructive. But if we keep things in perspective, do it in moderation, do it carefully, then some competition can be healthy or at least innocuous, and so on. Those are the two positions, a sort of extreme support and a moderate support. And it took me many years to discover that there's something wrong with both of these positions. Not everything that's bad when done to excess is okay when done in moderation. Some things are destructive by their very nature, and the best amount of that thing is none at all. I mean, this is clearly true for some things we would acknowledge, like some poison, some toxins, where even a little bit can be destructive, even though it's not as bad as a lot, but the ideal amount is to consume none of it. And that is what I ultimately concluded based on many years of research in psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics, biology, education, leisure studies, and other fields. In what became my first book in English, called No Contest, The Case Against Competition, which I understand has recently been, I'm happy to say, translated into Polish many years later. And I came to the heretical conclusion that the ideal amount of competition in all environments is none at all, because there is no such thing as healthy competition. The ideal amount is to avoid it completely. Now, that is a view that many people find very difficult to accept, because we have all been carefully raised to accept the idea that competition is desirable. We have been socialized, even brainwashed, to accept this uncritically, to treat it more like a religious belief than a scientific hypothesis. And to me, that's very disturbing, because many things that we've been raised to believe turn out not to be beneficial at all. And I think this is one of them. Here I am talking about competition not in the individual sense of people who have a personal need for psychological reason to beat other people, but a structural version of competition that sets up the rules of the game, so to speak, even if it's not a literal game, so that I can succeed only if you fail. Setting it up that way in an economic system, within a workplace, within a classroom or school, or of course on a playing field. The structural version is the hardest one to deal with. And competition in a structural sense makes its presence felt in so many areas of our lives. In the way we compete to see whose country's schools are better, even based on test scores, which it turns out are lousy measures of intellectual aptitude or proficiency. The idea, of course, here is that if we are using international tests and students of many countries take them, then we want our country's students to score the best and have the highest rank. When you take a moment to think about that, what you're saying is that we want children who live in other countries not to learn effectively, which I believe is both an intellectually and a morally bankrupt position. There are many, many different aspects of lives in your culture and mine where we just take it for granted that things have to be set up as a kind of race where we can't all be first. And one of the things I began to notice is that when you raise questions about the desirability of this arrangement, people come back and say to you, doesn't matter what you think about it, it's inevitable. It's just human nature to compete and try to win. And so in my book, having heard claims like that so often at dinner parties and other casual conversations, I had figured there must be a substantial amount of research to justify that. And it turns out that no research supports that position. If you look at cross-cultural anthropology, you find that there are many cultures where there is virtually no competition in the way that resources are distributed, in the way that children are raised and taught, in the way that they have fun and play games. The cultures without any competition tend to be those that are less industrialized. We used to call them more primitive cultures. And if you think about that for a moment, it's rather ironic. If competition was just part of human nature, then you would expect the less industrialized, more natural cultures to be the most competitive. And that is not the case. There's also evidence from early childhood education that when children are taught cooperative ways to learn and to play, they tend to absorb that lesson instead. And there is even evidence from evolutionary biology suggesting that there are some species that compete, but many more that try to avoid competition. Dominance hierarchies or pecking orders are really established to minimize competition, which turns out to be counterproductive for just about everybody. If you know what your role is, you're less likely to try to have an unproductive struggle for dominance. The same thing is true of migration in many species. If there's not enough food or water for all of us, we go over there so we don't have to compete. I will summarize the research from many fields as follows. We compete because we're raised that way, not because we're born that way. So we can't dismiss conveniently the whole question of whether competition is desirable by shrugging our shoulders and saying that's just life. It is life only in certain historical periods, in certain cultures, and in certain institutions and organizations. So we are not only allowed, but encouraged to raise the question, does this arrangement make sense? Because if it doesn't, then we ought to be looking for another way, either doing tasks independently or doing them cooperatively.